and under his own authority and not white authority. The Nation of Islam applied the law of displacement by occupying our time completely as members, end quote. As a consequence, the greatest benefit from the Nation of Islam was that it created an independent position for African Americans. Quote, it gave us a sense of qualification without reference to credentials. The myth of Yaqub. The cornerstone of the work of Professor W.D. Farad was the myth of Yaqub. Imam Muhammad gave a brief summary of this aspect of Professor Farad's strategic myth at the University of North Carolina. He said, Farad built his myth from the Bible story of Jacob wrestling with his brother Esau and stealing his birthright and stealing also his inheritance. So Farad took that and made a myth about the beginning of the white race, and he said that he didn't use Jacob because he knew he could go to Jacob. It's easy to find. He used the Arabic term for Jacob, and we didn't know Arabic. He called him Yaqub. He said there was a great scientist, Yaqub, in his myth, and this great scientist studied the genes of black people and discovered that white people could be grafted from black people. So he grafted out of black people a white race. According to the myth, before he did this, there was no white race existing. He ordered his people to follow his plan, to follow his formula for creating a new race, and they followed it for 600 years. After 600 years, they had white people. White people were created in the area called Patmos in the Aegean Sea over there where Greece is. Farad said they created a new race, and this race started to be the enemy of the black race, and this race used the science of their creator, Yaqub, to conquer the mind of the black race, and they eventually conquered the mind of the black race, and that's how we became inferior to whites and slaves in America. I'm giving it to you really quickly. It's much longer than that. So he said that a black man, Yaqub was a black man now, created the white race by grafting the white race out of the black people, and that bothered my mind. I said, well, that's fascinating, but how can we blame white people if a black man created them to do this that they've done to us? So in his mythology, he really gave us language with the intention that once we became better educated or started to use our minds, we would undo his language, and then, and when we do, that we would at least be free from the past, that is the historic trauma of the African American psyche. Because we rejected the past, his psychology was to have us reject the past. We would be free from the past and be free of him too. And that's exactly what happened. An independent and stable identity for African Americans. Professor Farad's teaching said that he came on July 4th, 1930, America's Independence Day. This was his way of symbolically stating his main objective, which was African American self-sufficiency. The Nation of Islam, in the light of the history of the so-called American Negro, as we were called in Professor Farad's doctrine, made a great contribution to African American identity and reform. Farad's belief was that upon a reform identity, African Americans could achieve. So you see the connection here, right? The FOI uniforms were red, white, and blue. And those are the colors of America, red, white, and blue. Right? So we were wearing the colors of the flag all the time. And when we were walking in the building and said the symbol of slavery, suffering, and death, right? But you're wearing it, and then he put in his doctrine, I came alone July 4th, 1930, but all that is symbolism to say, I came here to bring you to independence. Okay? All right. Where are we at now? Farad's belief was upon reform. All right. On many occasions, Imam Muhammad elaborated on the African American's need for a stable identity and the foundations for it. He said, when a person has no sense of originality comes from the word origin. When the origin is lost and the connection is not made, then the victim carries the burden of lost identity. That is what we have carried all these centuries and generations, that we have been in this situation. We have carried a lost identity. As long as we sense the loss as a burden, it will be a problem for us. But if we can ever confront the loss with our rational mind and try to dispel the darkness in that situation so that we can understand it, it will not be necessary for a people to go back to what they were in order to have a sense of their identity or a sense of freedom or a sense of originality. It is only necessary that they confront it with their rational mind and accept it, explore it, and examine it so that you will know it and understand it. Then you can either try to reconstitute that life or you can say it's not worth it. Begin where you are or the reality that you are in as the realm of your reality. Then you will have a sense of your originality, an identity that will satisfy you and not the burden of a lost identity. That is what has happened to us naturally. I do not carry a burden of lost identity, end quote. In the Harlem Address, Imam Muhammad went on to explain that the Nation of Islam under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was successful at bringing out survivors of the experiment of white supremacy. The Imam explained that Elijah Muhammad said of his own mission, "My job is to put you in a new dress." The way that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad accomplished this was to teach the excellence of civilized moral behavior. In caution and criticism, however, Imam Muhammad said that the new dress is sometimes more important than the actual person. So he said the problem is that white supremacy and the Nation of Islam extended themselves from a false premise, which was that man was God, and such a premise weakens your reality. Elijah Muhammad and the birth of free independent thinking. The linchpin that fastened the suture between the Black Freedom Movement and Islam in America was Elijah Muhammad. Imam Muhammad said, "Never was a black man more drawn to a person than my father was to that man called W.D. Farad. This man came with a magnetism that we had never known or experienced." The work of Elijah Muhammad from 1933 to 1975 is well documented in other publications. However, the emphasis here is to grasp the trajectory and the significance of the work of Professor Farad, Elijah Muhammad, and Imam W.D. Muhammad. It was and is the combined force of his two predecessors' interconnection which culminated in the man and the Imam W.D. Muhammad. Professor Farad left his strategy with Elijah Muhammad, but not without first compelling a promise from Elijah Muhammad and his then pregnant wife, Clara Evans Poole. Muhammad, regarding, that is her last name, Clara, that is Clara Evans Poole's her name, then of course Clara Muhammad, regarding their unborn child. Though it is well known that Imam Muhammad transformed the Nation of Islam members from black supremacy ideology to the acceptance of a global and by and large the traditional frame of understanding al-Islam, yet and still the true contribution that Imam Muhammad made and makes to the Muslim American community and the world began many years before February 26, 1975. Indeed, it began before his birth. The circumstances of his birth and Imam Muhammad's existence itself were great contributions to the Muslim American community and to the world. These were manifestations of perhaps one of the most unprecedented events that ever occurred on American soil. As incredible, mysterious, and as implausible as it might seem in the eyes of some or in the eyes of many, the very life of Imam Muhammad has a mythical quality to it that is inescapable as the fact that he existed at all. Understanding the significant nature and magnitude of the challenges faced by Imam Muhammad from his cradle to his grave is a critical necessity for ascertaining an appropriate respect for his contribution. During a South Carolina lecture, Imam Muhammad described this part of his history. He said, quote, "Wallace D. Farad, I was named after that man. He named me before I was born, and my mother and father told me that he took chalk and wrote my name on the back of a door, Wallace D. And he told my mother and father, when this child is born, promise me that you will name him after me. And he wrote the name on the back of the door and for them to remember what to name me. He said to them, promise me that you will raise him to help us in this work. He said, us. So he sensitized my parents and sensitized me to grow up one day and accept the responsibility to help Mr. Farad and my father." end quote. So even before Imam Muhammad was born, his life was being preconditioned for the work that he ultimately would do. It was through the influences arising from Professor Farad's strategy for black reconditioning and its faithful execution by Elijah Muhammad that Imam Muhammad came into a particular kind of mind that he was born for in his mission. The two most critical influences impressed upon Imam Muhammad from both Farad Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad were how to comprehend and apply symbolic language and how to be a courageous, independent thinker. In an address published in the Muslim Journal, Imam Muhammad explained those influences. He said, quote, "My father was a leader of something, and he told me and his followers, especially his ministers, and those who could get near him, who were invited to the house, speaking from Elijah Muhammad, quoting Elijah Muhammad, he said, don't just read, but think deep. Reading and studying to search the depths of the message or the language or the teaching is an exercise for your intelligence. It is an exercise for your brain. It will develop the brain more and more. Not questioning things, not being curious, not trying to see if there's more into something than appears to the eye on the surface, not being interested in doing that gives little exercise for your brain," end quote. Continuing to illustrate this quality as an important discipline in all education, the Imam said, quote, "I went to junior college. I took English to learn how to speak better so I could do my job better with you. I also took literature, where they would give you a passage to read. After you have read the passage, the teacher does not want you to tell them what you just read. He wants you to tell him what you found with your own reasoning power, your own logic, your own intelligence." Elijah Muhammad was not a college professor and did not know their methodologies, but he gave us a challenge, and that challenge exercised the muscles of our intelligence and made his son very strong in the muscles of the brain. As regards the particular symbolic language of the Nation of Islam, the Imam elaborated on the effects of Professor Farad's strategy in his father's teaching on his own way of being. That is how it impacted him. In Charleston, South Carolina, February 26, 2002, the Imam said this, quote, when I read where his teacher said to speak well, when I read where his teacher said to speak well, you must learn how to use the terms properly, I asked myself, what does that mean? Yes, he wants you to speak. Speak to who? To speak to the public. But you can't speak well to that public until you learn how to put the terms that he uses in the proper places. When I read that, I was encouraged. Then I was searching with more enthusiasm because I believed that if I could break the code of this language, then I could use these terms properly and I would be successful when I spoke. That is what he said, and that is what I followed, and I am successful, end quote. Puzzling out Farad Muhammad's language. Imam Muhammad's first success was unraveling and comprehending the strategy and language of his father's teacher, and then setting about freeing the former followers of Professor Farad and of his father for the purpose of getting them onto the business of realizing through al-Islam their personal and community destiny. After accepting his ratification as the leader of the Nation of Islam in February 26, 1975, it was the unraveling of the work of Professor Farad and the followers of the Nation of Islam after the passing of Elijah Muhammad, which constituted the first step in Imam Muhammad's particular mission for al-Islam in America. To appreciate the subtle complexity and excellence of the work of Imam Muhammad in this regard, it requires understanding the nature and significance of the strategy and methodology of Professor Farad. Imam Muhammad explained the work of Farad as he is sometimes called on numerous occasions. He said once, quote, Mr. Farad had a scheme, a strategy to attract us, to build up ourselves in a way that we would be happy and proud of our achievements in the Nation of Islam or the temples of Islam. But he knew that when the circumstances would favor us coming out as citizens with full rights of citizenship, the intelligent ones and the educated ones who could see light in Scripture separated from the ink print, that eventually one from among us would lead us to the international ummah of Muhammad, end quote. Further elaborating on Farad's strategy, he said, the man introduced